Since 1998, when it was announced that we had a budgetary surplus to deal with, the national debt has nevertheless grown by more than $230 billion, albeit at a rate less than in the past, but certainly a sum that should not be ignored. But the really big borrowing has been what the U.S. as a whole has borrowed from foreigners to pay for the huge deficit we have in our current account. We are now by far the largest foreign debtor in the world and in all of history. The convenient arrangement has allowed us to live beyond our means and, according to long understood economic laws, must end. A declining dollar confirms that our ability to painlessly borrow huge sums will no longer be cheap or wise. During the past 30 years in the post-Bretton Woods era, worldwide sentiment has permitted us to inflate our money supply and get others to accept the dollar as if it were as good as gold. This convenient arrangement has discouraged savings, which are now at an historic low. Savings in a capitalist economy are crucial for furnishing capital and establishing market interest rates. With negative savings and with the Fed fixing rates by creating credit out of thin air and calling it capital, we have abandoned a necessary part of free market capitalism, without which a smooth and growing economy is sustainable. No one should be surprised when recessions hit or bewildered as to their cause or danger. The greater surprise would be the endurance of an economy fine-tuned by a manipulative central bank and a compulsively interventionist Congress. But the full payment for our last economic sins may now be required. Let's hope we can keep the pain and suffering to a minimum. The most recent new era of the 1990s appeared to be an answer to all politicians' dream: a good economy, low unemployment, minimal price inflation, a skyrocketing stock market with capital gains tax revenue flooding the Treasury, thus providing money to accommodate every special interest demand. But it was too good to be true. It was based on inflated currency and massive corporate, personal, and government borrowing. A recession was inevitable to pay for the extravagance that many knew was an inherent part of the new era, understanding that abundance without commensurate amount of work was not achievable. The mantra now is for the Fed to quickly lower short-term interest rates to stimulate the economy and alleviate a liquidity crisis. This policy may stimulate a boom and may help in a mild downturn, but it doesn't always work in a bad recession. It actually could do great harm, since it could weaken the dollar, which in turn would allow market forces instead to push long-term interest rates higher. Deliberately lowering interest rates isn't even necessary for the dollar to drop, since our policy has led to a current account deficit of a magnitude that demands the dollar eventually readjusts and weakens. A slumping stock market will also cause the dollar to decline and interest rates to rise. Federal Reserve Board central planning, though, through interest rate control, is not a panacea. It is instead the culprit that produces the business cycle. Government and Fed officials have been reassuring the public that no structural public problems exist, citing no inflation and a gold price that reassures the world that the dollar is indeed still king. The Fed can create excess credit, but it can't control where it goes as it circulates throughout the economy. Nor can it dictate value. Claiming that a subdued government-rigged CPI and PPI proves that no inflation exists is pure nonsense. It is well established that under certain circumstances, new credit inflation can find its way into the stock or real estate market, as it did in the 1920s, while consumer prices remain relatively stable. This does not negate the distortions inherent in a system charged with artificially low interest rates. Instead, it allows the distortion to last longer and become more serious, leading to a bigger correction. If gold prices reflected the true extent of the inflated dollar, confidence in the dollar specifically and in paper more generally would be undermined. It is a high priority of the Fed and all central banks of the world for this not to happen. Revealing to the public the fraud associated with all paper money would cause loss of credibility of all central banks. This knowledge would jeopardize the central bank's ability to perform the role of lender of last resort and to finance and monetize government debt. It is for this reason that the price of gold in their eyes must be held in check. From 1945 to 1971, the United States literally dumped nearly 500 million ounces of gold at $35 an ounce in an effort to do the same thing by continuing the policy of printing money at will with the hopes that there would be no consequences to the value of the dollar. That all ended in 1971 when the markets overwhelmed the world's central bankers. A similar effort continues today with central banks selling and loaning gold to keep the price in check. It's working and does convey false confidence, but it can't last. Most Americans are wise to the government statistics regarding prices and the no inflation exists rhetoric. Everyone is aware that the prices of oil, gasoline, natural gas, medical care, repairs, houses, and entertainment have all been rapidly rising. The artificially low gold price has aided the government's charade, but it has also allowed a bigger bubble to develop. This policy cannot continue. Economic law dictates a correction that most Americans will find distasteful and painful. Duration and severity of the liquidation phase of the business cycle can be limited by proper responses, but it cannot be avoided and could be made worse if the wrong course is chosen. Recent deterioration of the junk bond market indicates how serious the situation is. Junk bonds are now paying 9 to 10% more than short-term government securities. The quality of business loans is suffering, while more and more corporate bonds are qualifying for junk status. The Fed tries to reassure us by attempting to stimulate the economy with low short-term Fed funds rate. At the same time, interest rates for businesses and consumers are rising. There comes a time when Fed policy is ineffective, much to everyone's chagrin. Micromanaging the economy effectively for a long period of time, even with the power of a central bank wields, is an impossible task. The good times are ephemeral and eventually must be paid for by contraction and renewed real savings. There is much more to inflation than rising prices. Inflation is defined as the increase in the supply of money and credit. Obsessively sticking to the rising prices definition conveniently ignores placing the blame on the responsible party, the Federal Reserve. The last thing central banks or the politicians who need a backup for all their spending mischief want is for the government to lose its power to create money out of thin air, which serves political and privileged financial interests. When the people are forced to think about rising prices, government-doctored price indices can dampen concerns for inflation. Blame then can be laid at the doorstep of corporate profiteers, price gouging, labor unions, oil sheiks, or greedy doctors. But it is never placed at the feet of the highly paid athletes or entertainers. It would be economically incorrect to do so, but it's political correctness that doesn't allow some groups to be vilified. Much else related to artificially low interest rates goes unnoticed. An overpriced stock market, overcapacity in certain industries, excesses in real estate markets, artificially high bond prices, general malinvestment, excessive debt, and speculation all result from the generous and artificial credit the Federal Reserve pumps into the financial system. These distortions are every bit, if not more harmful than rising prices. As the economy soars from the stimulus effect of low interest rates, growth and distortions compound themselves. In a slump, the reverse is true, and the pain and suffering is magnified as the adjustment back to reality occurs. The extra credit in the 1990s has found its way especially into the housing market like never before. Government-sponsored enterprises, in particular Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, have gobbled up huge sums to finance a booming housing market. GSE securities enjoy implicit government guarantees which have allowed for a generous discount on most housing loans. They have also been the vehicles used by consumers to refinance and borrow against their home equity to use these funds for other purposes, such as investment in the stock market. This has further undermined savings by using the equity that builds with price inflation that homeowners enjoy when money is debased. In addition, the Federal Reserve now buys and holds GSE securities as collateral in their monetary operations. These securities are then literally used as collateral for printing Federal Reserve notes. This is a dangerous precedent. If monetary inflation merely raised prices and all prices and labor costs moved up at the same rate, and it did not cause disequilibrium in the market, it would be of little consequence. But inflation is far more than rising prices. Creating money out of thin air is morally equivalent to counterfeiting. It is fraud and theft because it steals purchasing power from the savers and those on fixed incomes. That in itself should compel all nations to prohibit it, as did the authors of our Constitution. Inflation is socially disruptive in that the management of fiat money, as all today's currencies are, causes great hardships. Unemployment is a direct consequence of the constantly recurring recessions. Persistent rising costs impoverish many as the standard of living of unfortunate groups erodes. Because the pain and suffering that comes from monetary debasement is never evenly distributed, certain segments of society actually benefit. In the 1990s, Wall Streeters thrived while some low-income, non-welfare non-homeowners suffered with rising costs for fuel, rent, repairs, and medical care. Generally, one should expect the middle class to suffer and to literally be wiped out in a severe inflation. When this happens, as it did in many countries throughout the 20th century, social and political conflicts become paramount when finger-pointing becomes commonplace by those who suffer looking for scapegoats. Almost always, the hostility is inaccurately directed. There is a greater threat from the monetary mischief than just the economic harm it does. The threat to liberty resulting when economic strife hits and finger-pointing increases should concern us most. We should never be complacent about monetary policy. We must reassess the responsibility Congress has in maintaining a sound monetary system. In the 19th century, the constitutionality of a central bank was questioned and challenged. Not until 1913 were the advocates of a strong federalist system able to foist a powerful central bank on us while destroying the gold standard. This banking system, which now serves as the financial arms of Congress, has chosen to pursue massive welfare spending and a foreign policy that has caused us to be at war for much of the 20th century. Without the central bank creating money out of thin air, our welfare state and worldwide imperialism would have been impossible to finance. Attempts at economic fine-tuning by monetary authorities would have been impossible without a powerful central bank. Propping up the stock market as it falters would be impossible as well. But the day will come when we will have no choice but to question the current system. Yes, the Fed does help to finance the welfare state. Yes, the Fed does come to the rescue when funds are needed to fight wars and for us to pay the cost of maintaining our empire. Yes, the Fed is able to stimulate the economy and help create what appears to be good times. But it's all built on an illusion. Wealth cannot come from a printing press. Empires crumble and a price is eventually paid for arrogance toward others. And booms inevitably turn into busts. Talk of a new era these past 5 years had many believing, including Greenspan, that this time it really would be different. And it may indeed be different this time. The correction could be an especially big one, since the Fed-driven distortion of the past 10 years plus the lingering distortions of previous decades have been massive. The correction could be made big enough to challenge all our institutions, the entire welfare state, Social Security, foreign intervention, and our national defense. This will only happen if the dollar is knocked off its pedestal. No one knows if that is going to happen soon or later. But when it does, our constitutional system of government will be challenged to the core. Ultimately, the solution will require a recommitment to the principles of liberty, including a belief in sound money, when money once again will be something of value rather than pieces of paper or mere blips from a Federal Reserve computer. In spite of the grand technological revolution, we are still having trouble with a few simple, basic tasks: counting votes, keeping the lights on, or even understanding the sinister nature of paper money. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time, and I will continue this in special order tomorrow.
Does the gentleman yields back his time.
Yes.